Do you ever use the words or term, can you do me a favour? Do you ever do that? I'm seeing you girls, you say that often too. It's normally when you've just sat down, isn't it? And someone's, oh, can you do me a favour? Like I was working in one of the bedrooms last week, and Yayan came up and he said, how are you doing, Dad? And he had this lovely shiny apple, and he was eating it, and it looked, before I'd seen it, I wasn't thinking of an apple, but it looked delicious. And, oh, is that a nice apple? Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's lovely, yeah. Oh, it's delicious. Yeah, we got loads. And I said, oh, do me a favour, yeah? Can you get me one? He's like, do I have to go downstairs to get you an apple? But thankfully, he did give me an apple, and it was delicious, and he was grateful. So, but sometimes we can say, oh, do me a favour, because we want something, or maybe sometimes because we're a bit lazy and we want someone else to do something for us. But sometimes people do favours for us when we don't ask it, or when we don't deserve it, and someone does a favour because of their love for you, or because it's maybe been laid on their heart. They'll do something for you, and you might not deserve it, you might not have asked it, but it's a real favour and it's a real blessing and to receive it. And I want you to think, have you ever experienced the favour of God in your life? So have you ever experienced like the favour of God in your life? It could be a long period of time or just a significant moment where you've experienced and walked in the favour of God. Because Ezra 1, when we started this in January, shows us a clear example almost of just God's unbelievable favour to his people. We read of a Persian king who's almost in charge of the entire world, and yet God changes his heart, moves his heart, and then he sets his slaves, effectively, these people of Israel, he sets them free to go back and rebuild the kingdom of God. There's no benefit in one sense to him for that, but it's just the favour of God in making him do this. And then Ezra 6, which we're looking today, is almost returning that favour. Is almost coming back to that favour as it's been through resistance and opposition. It's coming back to that in Ezra 6. And in the Bible, like Graham just prayed as well then, he talked about experience God's grace and favour. And in the Bible, grace and favour is quite similar. For us who have received Jesus as our Saviour by grace through faith, we would say that we know, don't we, and we live in the favour of God. Like this is something that we appreciate, and we live in the grace and favour of God. So simply put, being a Christian is living in God's favour. And it's not saying that we're God's favourites. It's the difference between saying we're God's favourites and favour. We're not saying we're better than others, but we're simply receiving it, aren't we? We're simply receiving God's grace, his love, and his favour by accepting Jesus. But also, favour comes in sometimes when God reveals his plans and just asks us simply to be a part of it, or allows us. Like it's when Jesus saw Matthew, the tax collector. It's not because Matthew was a really righteous man, or he loved God, or he knew his scriptures. Actually, he was known as a sinner in that sense, and a dodgy tax collector. But so it wasn't even about him. It was just Jesus was saying, the favour of God is on me. Do you want to be a part of it? Do you want to follow me? Do you want to be a part and follow me? And today, it's amazing when God reveals something that is clearly from him, like his will. Because sometimes knowing God's will in our life, sometimes it's difficult, isn't it? It's like, is this of him, or is this of me? Am I making this up? Is this my feelings? Is this in line with his word? But sometimes when we know this is clearly God's will, and we get to walk in it, it's just an amazing experience. It's an amazing favour that we get to be a part of. And he simply reveals something that's clearly from him, and he simply says, well, do you want to join me? Like, do you want to be a part of this? Do you want to walk in my favour? And I may have told you this story before, but when I became a Christian when I was 18, I knew God's plan for my life very early on was to be in full-time Christian ministry, to serve him full-time. I actually knew it before I became a Christian, because I was brought up in church and people would pray or prophesy over my life, even though I didn't want them to. And so it kind of put me off as well. And think, I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to. So I kind of knew before even becoming a Christian. But when I became a Christian, I felt that I knew that's what I wanted. And so I just pursued God, which ended up me doing some traveling, doing a Christian gap year and doing missionary work, and then spending quite a bit of time in Swansea then, working with churches. And I got a part-time youth work job. I was studying a youth work degree and serving the church in a volunteer capacity. And I did this for about 5 years. And then there was a Swansea Christian youth work job came up in Swansea. And I was like, thank you, Jesus. This is mine. You've made it clear. And it sounds really arrogant right now. But I was like, I knew all the other youth workers in Swansea. I kind of felt, I know I've got more experience. I know I've got the qualification. And I know God has called me to this. So I was like, God's revealed it. Like, this is what he wants me. And had the job interview and felt confident and just waiting for it. And I didn't get it. And I was like, what's going on? Like, how is this? I thought this was your will in my life. I thought this was your plan. This just doesn't make sense. And I felt hurt in one sense and a bit angry. I was like, surely this is clearly your will. And at that time then, me and Becky were married and we had a mortgage, and one of my jobs, because the youth work was funded, it was ending, so I needed a full-time job. So I just needed to apply for anything. And I applied for this full-time youth work jobs that was basically set up by Muslims to help Muslim young people, but it was a charity in that sense. So I applied for it out of a laugh, really. Because I thought, I haven't got any experience. I'd never even met a Muslim before then, because I was brought up in the valleys. And so I was like, I'll just apply for it, because the money seemed right and I needed a full-time job. So I applied for it as a laugh. And then got a letter back then saying, you got an interview. And like literally when me and Becky saw it, we were kind of laughing, just like, well, what's this about? And then I went for the interview, and it went well as I could, and obviously shared about I was a Christian. All my experience really was mainly Christian. So I just thought, it was a good experience, good to see them. And then got offered the job then, and again, me and Becky were laughing, just like, what's this about? What's going on? How does this all make sense? Like, I thought my role was full-time Christian ministry, and now I'm working among Muslims then, and just didn't really make sense. But I loved the job, and it opened my eyes to Islam and to working with Muslims. I made some great friends there, met some great people, and got to share my faith in ways that I've never been able to share my faith before, and learned a lot more about other faiths, but also got to explain to them why Jesus was the Son of God and not just a prophet, and just great experience. But then, so it was a really good time, but because of youth work is funded related, and so after I think a year or 2 years, my boss, who was an atheist, and my manager, who was a Muslim, sat me down and said, okay, Matt, we appreciate, we really like you being part of the team, but because it's all funded, we can't guarantee funding in regards to the next set and different things like that. We obviously would try, but they asked me the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And I said, I see myself in full-time Christian ministry. That's what I felt God has called me to do, and that's what I feel called. And then they said, I'm laughing because it's still quite hilarious. They asked me then, so is there training in that? And I said, yeah, there's Bible college courses and theology courses and things like that. And she said, well, is there anything that you could do whilst you still work for us? And I'd heard about the Highfields Network course, and so where you go there half day a week and do some studies and things. I said, well, there is one. And she said, they just look into this. And so I looked into it, got the details, and came back to them. And they said, yeah, well, go for that then. And it was amazing because, like, not only did they say, oh, you could do this, they said, oh, we'll class it as work hours, we'll pay for your petrol and travel, and also they'll pay for the course. So, like, over $2,000 in that sense. Like, so whilst I was working with Muslims, amongst Muslims, sharing my faith, like, they paid for me to do a Christian theology course, like, out of their funding. And it was just, like, the unbelievable, like, just, and I'm not saying anything about myself or I made that happen or it was about me, but it was an experience for me. Like, I was just walking in the favour of God, just like, this is, like, just God's favour and just over my life right now. And he's just basically made an open door and just said, oh, Matt, like, do you want to walk in it? Like, do you want to join me? And so, like, it was amazing to just join him, and I'll always remember that, like, with a smile on my face, that for me, like, the favour of God in my life in that situation is he opened a door which seemed impossible, like Ezra 1, like, and opened a door which didn't make sense, and just said, oh, do you want to join me? Like, do you want to join me in my favour? And he made it possible. And then go relating that back to Ezra, we're now in Ezra 6, and the people of Israel are about to return to the favour of God that started in Ezra 1. Like I said, in Ezra 1, which we heard a few weeks ago, God moved in King Cyrus of Persia's heart to allow his people to go and rebuild God's house. So the people went, they started, they rebuilt the foundations, they praised God and with sounds and sacrifice. They started rebuilding sacrifice and praise. But then we heard the last few weeks it was going well, but then the people around them wanted to help, which at first sounds quite generous. But this wasn't just rebuilding a building, this was rebuilding a people. And God, throughout the Old Testament, would say, don't mix with those around you, don't intermarry with those around you, because the other beliefs and the systems overtook it, so protect them. And so the Israelites didn't allow these people to be a part of it, and then they brought opposition. They were like, well, they don't want us to be part of it, well, we'll stop it, we'll do everything we can. So one of them, main guy called Tatanai, wrote to a different king, Xerxes, and said to search through the history scrolls and to basically find, look, you're allowing these Israelites to build. These are really bad guys, because throughout history they've overtaken other kingdoms and they don't pay taxes. So when the King Xerxes looked at this, he's like, well, no, that was a mistake, let's stop them. And Stu shared about how they stopped then for many years, up to 16 years. But then in this time of stopping, God raised up prophets to tell the people to start building again, even though they hadn't had the announcement they'd start building again. And then the opposition were not happy, so they basically grassed them up. This Tatanai then wrote to the King Cyrus and said again, like, look, these guys have been told to stop, and now they're starting. Look, search through the history records, your scrolls. These are not good people. You can't allow this to happen. You need to stop them again. But this time, they got the reply that they didn't want. This time, like, the favour of God was being restored, re-established. And this time, the outcome was different. And it says this, if you've got your Bibles, it's in Ezra 6, verse 1 to 12. But the words are going to be on screen. But God's favour from Ezra 1 was about to return and overthrow the opposition. And it says this in Ezra 6, verses 1 to 12. These are the first few verses. And it says, King Darius then issued an order, and they searched in the archives stored in the treasury at Babylon. A scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media, and this was written on it. In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifice, and let its foundation be laid. It is to be 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide, with 3 courses of large stones and 1 of timbers. The costs are to be paid by the royal treasury. Look at that line, that's crazy, isn't it? The costs are to be paid by the royal treasury. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar, so before these people, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, are now to be returned to their places in the temple of Jerusalem. They are to be deposited there in the house of God. And I bet when Tata and I read this first part, it was almost like a gulp in his throat. Like, oh no, this was not what I wanted. I wanted another 16 years of stopping, and then all of a sudden this comes. And it got worse for him and his people, which we're about to read. But as Christians, like, sometimes we can get, and more as human beings, we can get absorbed in the moment, can't we? We can get absorbed in the moment, caught up in the moment, and sometimes the moment is too big, it's too hard, and sometimes we want to think of the future. We want to think of like the 5-year plan, or what we're going to do about this, or how we see ourselves in 10 years' time. But sometimes looking at the future can be bleak. Like right now, not many people have got a 5-year plan in COVID because they're unsure about it. And so in the present, it can be too much, and the future can look bleak. So what do we do then? We have to look back. We have to look back at the promises of God, like the faithfulness of God, the history of God in our lives. We have to look back at how he's been in our lives. And I asked at the start, have you ever experienced the favour of God in your life? But I didn't give you much time before I told you my story. But what I'd love you to do is, today, this afternoon, because tomorrow, if we're honest, sometimes we can forget on Monday morning what we said on Sunday. But do this afternoon, look back in your life and try, and even if it's just one moment, try and think, when did I experience the favour of God? When was a time where God's favour in my life was clear and I just walked in it? There was an opportunity and I just walked in it. Have a think over your life. When have you experienced the favour of God? And when you get that, put it on the family WhatsApp group. Like, share it or send it to a friend, or just journal it for yourself. But do it. Because as I shared my story of my favour to you, like, that encouraged me. Like, I was, oh yeah, I look back and, oh, that was amazing. That was like over 10 years ago, but that encouraged me. But I could see in your faces, you guys were encouraged as well. Like, you were encouraged by seeing that. So not only when we look back does it encourage ourselves, but when we share it, we encourage others. So look back at the favour of God in your life this afternoon. And either keep it for yourself almost as a treasure that you jot down, that you make a marker on, or share it with others. Share it to see the favour of God in your life, because that'll help you not just in the moment, but in the future, to know that God has got you in his hand and he's got a good track record. And just one line that could be for one person here today or online, that stood out to me. Literally, as I was reading it, verse 5 stood out to me, and I felt the Spirit nudged me to say, and you can see there, verse 5 says, also the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, are to be returned to their places in the temple of Jerusalem. And the Spirit nudged me to just say to someone here or someone online, or maybe more than one person, that God will return what the enemy has stolen from you. God will return what the enemy has stolen from you. Now, you might think the enemy has taken this, or you might even be questioning if God has taken it, or if this is part of the will, or if things will always be like this, or how am I ever going to get this back? But God will return what the enemy has stolen from you. He will return it, what you stolen. That could be your joy. It could be your joy. It could be many things. It could be your joy. It could be your vulnerability. It could be your relationships. But God will return what the enemy has stolen from you. He will return what the enemy has stolen from you. Nebuchadnezzar had stolen everything, all the gold and silver from the house of the temple. And I bet the people and the enemy laughed at that. And then God touches someone's heart and says, I'm returning it. The enemy had stolen it, and God had returned it. What the enemy has stolen, God will return to you. And then it goes on to this in verse 6. It says, now then, Tatanai, governor of the Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai, and you other officials of that province. So he's speaking specifically to them. And I love this line. He says, stay away from there. So he speaks to them in this letter, and he says, he basically says, you guys, shut up. Just stop talking. Go away. Don't send me another letter. Don't waste my time. Leave them alone. This has been accredited by the king. Go away. And then it says, do not interfere with the work on this temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild the house of God on its site. And then it gets worse for these guys. They kind of wanted it to end there, but it gets worse. It says, moreover, I hereby decree what you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God. Their expenses are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury from the revenues of the Trans-Euphrates, so that the work will not stop. That's a terrible line for them, isn't it? They're just absolutely gutted. They're like, oh, why do we send the letter? Now, not only does the work carry on, but these guys have to pay for it. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs, for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and olive oil, as requested by the priests of Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail, so that they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king of his sons. It shows a tiny line there in verse 10 why also this king was doing it. This king had heard about these Israelites who God wiped out the Egyptians. Do you know what I mean? So they were aware of that. So he's like, oh, I want these guys to pray for me and my sons, but you guys making a noise, you're going to pay for it. The enemy is going to pay for it. And for 16 years, Tatanai and the people surrounding Israel must have just laughed. They would have just laughed, isn't it, at the people of God. Laughing at the people of God, laughing at they believed this, they thought this, and now look where they are. And it seemed like the enemy had won. Yet God had now done a total 180 and not just reminded people of the favour, but he restarted the building. But the enemy had not only had to stay away, but they had to pay for it. Not only did they have to stay away, but they had to pay for it. And it's a tiny picture, isn't it? When Jesus comes back. When Jesus comes back and the enemy has to pay for it all. He has to pay for it all. He feels like he's in control. And Jesus comes back and the enemy has to pay for it all. He has to pay for everything he's done. And for me, just a simple reminder for me is a charity that was set up by Muslims, mainly for Muslims, paid for the start of my theology training. That was it. They paid for it. They paid for my money, my time, my fuel, and the course. They paid for it. And I love those guys, and I want them to know Jesus, but they don't. And so the religion, the belief of Islam is not in line with Scripture, is not in line with Jesus. And it takes people away from Jesus. And so that's an enemy in that sense, that anything that takes people away from Jesus is against Jesus. So my heart for them was to explain to them what Jesus was. But something that was set up not for Jesus, the Christ that we know, ended up paying for the start of my theology course. And that was an example of the enemy is not in control. Like, the enemy is not in control. God is in control. And when he wants, he can just click his finger and say, you can pay for that. Like, you think you're in control, you think you'll pay for it. You will pay for this. And finally it says this in verse 11. It says, furthermore, I decree that if anyone defies this edict, a beam is to be pulled from their house, and they are to be impaled on it. And for this crime, their house is to be made a pile of rubble. That's the severity now of this king is saying, like, if you didn't listen to me, this is what's going to happen. And may God, who caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or to destroy the temple in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence. And Matthew 16:18, Jesus says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Like, he will build his church. The only thing that's going to last forever is his church. Not Sainsbury's, not Argos, not the school, not our houses, not our work, not our shoes, not our cars, not our sheds, nothing. The only thing on this earth right now that is going to last forever is his word, it is people with his spirit, and which is his church. That is the only thing. So when you hear the media saying, oh, the church is dead, or is dying, or it's going to end, we don't need to worry about that, because Jesus has said he will build his church. He will build his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. There were times in the Old Testament where God brought his judgment to continue his will. And sometimes we want that, don't we? Sometimes we want our enemies to say, we'd love to have a letter like this to our enemies when we say, look, if you mess around with us, we're going to break your house down. Because we kind of want that protected, we want that strong arm. We want to say, oh, like, don't mess with us, or we're going to take you out. But then Jesus, we're going to be looking at Easter soon, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, who could have called on an army of angels to take out these guys. He could have called out an army of angels to take them out. Offers his life. He offers his life over instead. And he gives his life not only for us, but he gave his life for the people who would take him for him as well. And so instead of force, he calls us to carry out his will, his favour, with diligence, it says there. And being a part of God's favour is a massive blessing, but it also requires obedience, and it can be hard work. Like, I thought about through Jesus feeding the 5,000, and they only had a few loaves and the fish, and he just provided an amazing miracle, didn't he? And the disciples would be like, oh, this is amazing. Like, we're hanging out with Jesus, and look at this is awesome. And just feeding all these people. So it's an amazing miracle. But what did Jesus say? Oh, you guys have got to do the work. Like, you've got to feed them. And not only just feed them, but collect it. I like eating food. I don't really like doing the dishes. And Jesus say, like, you want to be a part of my favor? Like, my miracle, who I am? Like, it's a privilege, it's an honor, but it's also like hard work as well. And there's times where serving God can be hard work, but we're serving him because he's the king. We're serving him because he's the King of Kings. And that Highfields course that I shared with you, that was the start of 4 years training. And so when I started, it was just me and Becky. And so that was great. Like, it was a favour, it was part of my role. It didn't affect anything. And then not long after that, we had Yayan. And then that started the start of my degree in theology, where I'd travel up to Scotland, flying up a few weeks of the year, and then Bournemouth in the last year. So it was great at the start because we didn't have any kids. By the fourth year, in my last week of training, we were just about to have Billy. So like start the year, there's no kids. The fourth year, like we were just about to have our third child and finish off, go into my studies to finish off a degree. So walking in God's favour was great, and like it was clearly part of his will. But when you've had 3 children and juggling working full time and trying to love your wife and prioritise her, like that can be hard. That can be commitment, but it's recognising God's favour, but this is required to have diligence with it, to go forward, to serve him, not for our gain even in that sense, because he's simply the King of Kings. The band are going to come up